This video will describe the features that are associated with propositions. We see here a proposition, and for this particular proposition, all the features have these values. I'd like to describe all of the features that are associated with clauses, and we can see them here. All of these. We also have features for other syntactic categories. These will be described in subsequent videos. But for clauses, we have these. So the first one is type. The possible values are right here. Independent, meaning it's an independent proposition, an independent clause. Coordinate independent. There aren't any coordinate independent propositions in the semantic representations, but every language we've worked in, they've always wanted two short, simple propositions combined into one. So we bring the second small one into the first one, and it becomes a coordinate independent clause. A restrictive thing modifier, in other words, a relative clause. I read the book that I bought yesterday. A descriptive relative clause. My brother, who is writing a book, saw me yesterday. We have adverbial clauses that begin with various prepositions like although, or because, or when, or while, or after, or before, if, so that, etc. We have subject complements. For example, it is clear to me that he was here. There are many object complements in the semantic representations. Many verbs take an object complement clause. For example, John knows that they will be late. There are attributive patient clauses. These are clauses that they function as an argument of an adjective. For example, John is ready to walk, or John is afraid to read that book. John is afraid that Mary might read that book. When a subordinate clause serves as an argument of an adjective, we call it an attributive patient clause. And one more, closing quotation frame. These are included after a long monologue, for example, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. In some languages, they like to be reminded of who was speaking. So there's a short subordinate clause at the end of the quotation saying something simply like, said Jesus. And they're tagged as closing quotation frame clauses. There's an option to hide these because many languages don't want them. But if your language needs those, they're there and they're available. So these are the possible values for type. The next feature is illocutionary force, and these are the possible values. Declarative, in other words, a statement. Imperative, a command. Content interrogative, yes, no interrogative. Suggestive let's go to the store. Third person imperative, for example, light, exist. These are imperatives, but they are not addressed to a person, to a you, a second person singular plural. They're addressed to a third person. One more, imperative with emphasized agent. You give them bread. There are some places where it's an imperative, but we really want to emphasize the agent. So we tag those as imperative with emphasized agent. Topic noun phrase. We only allow two. The vast majority of the propositions have the agent, the most agent-like noun phrase is the topic noun phrase. In English we call those active. There are a few propositions that are passive. The most patient-like noun phrase is the topic noun phrase. We don't permit any other semantic rules to be the topic noun phrase. It's limited to these two. Speaker. We have a series of features whenever someone is speaking to someone else. We have a general category for the speaker, for example, adult daughter, adult son, angel, animal, boy, brother, etc., crowd, father, girl, God, government leader. There are quite a few. Soldier, son, wife, woman, etc. So these are general categories of the speaker. We have the exact same categories for the listener. So maybe a daughter is listening to her mother, or a father is listening to his son, or something like that. We have the speaker's attitude, neutral, familiar, endearing, polite, honorable, etc. We have the speaker's age. Sometimes older people use slightly different vocabulary than younger people. So we have general categories for age. Speaker-listener age. This tells us the relative age of the speaker compared to the listener. For example, maybe the speaker is older and a different generation, like a father to a son, a mother to a daughter. maybe the speaker is older, but still they're essentially the same generation, or essentially the same age. Maybe the speaker is younger and a different generation, younger or the same generation. Speech style. Now the system comes with just one value, not applicable. You are responsible, if your language uses different styles of speech, you are responsible for adding these values. This language that we're in right now, they have one value, honorable. But it's up to you to supply the values here. And you can just type them into the grid right here. Discourse genre, we don't use this very much. Most of the books that we've analyzed so far have been climactic narrative stories. The epistles, some are epistolary, some are expository, we have genealogies, but in general we haven't been using these. And notional structure schema, we haven't used this one at all. It's hidden generally by default. Salience band, we use a few of these. We use a pivotal storyline, and some languages have multiple storylines. In addition to a pivotal storyline, they have primary and secondary. We haven't been marking these. Someday we will. I've heard some languages need this information. Script predictable, we haven't been using this one. We do use backgrounded actions. Fairly often, languages encode the backgrounded actions differently. They have different grammatical mechanisms to signal that it's a backgrounded action. Flashback, we do mark. If a speaker is telling a story and then he has to refer back to some event that happened earlier in the past, we tag it as flashback. And your grammar needs to look for that flashback feature value and provide the appropriate morphology. So the listeners, the readers, they'll know this is flashback. We don't set the setting feature or the Arialis, author intrusion, cursive. We don't use these. Sequence. These are useful if there is more than one relative clause modifying a noun. We will mark them as first coordinate, coordinate, and last coordinate. Or if one verb has multiple object complements, we'll tag them as first, last, or coordinate. Location and paragraph. We use some of these. Title. Your grammar will need to look for discourse title and provide some word, like title, or however you say that in your language, some marker to signal that that sentence is a title and not part of the actual scripture. We do mark parenthetical comments, so your grammar needs to look for these. We do mark footnotes. We also mark study footnotes. We provide study footnotes, for example, in Genesis 3:15, where God is talking to Satan, and he says, he, referring to the woman's offspring or the woman's seed, he will crush your head and you will strike his feet. Even when that verse is perfectly translated into another language, when people read it, they think it's talking about a child and a snake. No one can understand or appreciate the significance of that verse unless a teacher tells them or a footnote tells them. So we do include study footnotes, and your software can look at these. Your grammar can look at these and tag them. They can be included or excluded. And we also mark questionable text. We mark implicit information. We had a lot of implicit information, but it's all tagged. And you can have this implicit information included during the translation process or excluded. And if you include it, you can mark it with brackets or something so that your MTTs know it's implicit and they can decide whether or not to keep it or exclude it. But we have these 5 categories of implicit information. Alternative analyses. These are used when the Bible scholars really don't know how to interpret a particular sentence. We'll look at what the commentaries say, and the translation helps. What do they say? And we'll choose one as the primary analysis, but then if it really is debatable about how to interpret a sentence, we'll include one or more alternative analyses. And your grammar should look at these and provide a tag indicating it's an alternative analysis. Then we also include literal alternates and dynamic alternates. For example, in Philippians, Paul talks about the day of Christ. So a literal alternate will refer to the day of Christ. scholars agree, the Bible scholars generally agree, that the day of Christ is the day when Christ returns to the earth again. So a dynamic alternate will be another sentence, but instead of referring to the day of Christ, it will refer to the day when Christ returns to the earth. So we have literal alternates and dynamic alternates. And you can decide in your translation, which do you want? For each particular audience, you specify literal alternates or dynamic alternates. Vocabulary alternates. These are for when there's a complex vocabulary and your language may or may not have a lexical equivalent. For example, when God says to Adam and Eve, be fruitful, fruitful is a complex concept, and many languages won't have an equivalent. So we put those in complex vocabulary alternates, and we always provide a simple vocabulary alternate. Instead of be fruitful, we'll have another alternate saying produce many babies or produce many children, something like that. So you can decide when you activate the complex concepts, the software will automatically choose either the complex vocabulary alternate or the simple vocabulary alternate. Rhetorical questions. In the original text, when there are rhetorical questions, we include a rhetorical question, and it's tagged as a rhetorical question. We also include an equivalent statement for the languages that don't use rhetorical questions. Or maybe even your language uses rhetorical questions, but if you're producing a translation for children, maybe you prefer the statements instead of rhetorical questions. So this is something you again specify for each particular audience. And those are all the features that we use in the semantic representations. Then we have some spares. And these other features down here are provided by rules. Rules that are included in the grammar library or somewhere that you can write. So if you decide to use some of the spares in the propositions, you should start down here with spare 10, spare 9, spare 8. We, in the future, we may start using some of these, 3, 4, 5. We'll work our way down this way, and you should work your way up this way if you decide to add some additional features to the propositions.